tonight's open lecture on how to disagree. My name's Jenny Bristow. I'm a reader in sociology here at Christ Church, and the way this event is going to work is I'm just going to start by doing the obligatory housekeeping announcements, which along the lines of turning phones off please, and if there's a fire alarm, it's probably a fire, so go out the front where there's no fire, and quickly. The way the event's going to work is that we're very fortunate to have our Vice Chancellor here, Rama, who will welcome Timandra, so I'm not going to duplicate what Rama's going to say about Timandra. Timandra will speak for about 20 minutes. Then we have Bob Bowie, who's Professor of Religion and Worldviews here at Christ Church, who will give a brief kind of response to Timandra, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. So we've got lots and lots of time for discussion, questions, comments. We'll finish at 7 o'clock promptly, because I know that otherwise people just have to get away for the evening and everything else. And then if anyone wants to, please join us for a drink at the Two Sawyers round the corner. So without further ado, Rob, oh, sorry, I meant to say we are going to record the introductions to this event, but not the whole discussion. So in the discussion, do feel free just to say what you want and not worry about being recorded. So, Rama, thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Jenny, and good evening, everybody. And genuinely a very warm welcome to the university here, and really looking forward to Timandra Harkness's lecture, How to Disagree. There cannot be a place more important than a university where we have to learn the art to disagree and to disagree well. I think, having spent all my life in universities one way or the other, it's really important that universities are places of discussion, debate, and where we have differences of view. As I was walking from my little humble bungalow to here this morning from Rough Common, I was walking down the hill and I was thinking about Galileo Galilei. And some of you will know Galileo Galilei was one of the first people to say that actually the Earth rotated around the sun rather than the other way around, which was what was believed particularly by the church at the time. And for promoting that view, that actually the Earth wasn't the central unit, it was the unit which rotated around the sun, he was imprisoned and then held in house arrest before he died. And I was just reflecting, and that shows to me, and until Magellan went going around the world in his ship, people believed the Earth was flat. So if you go back in time in history, we've got to be able to challenge received wisdom. We've got to be able to debate things which we may feel are uncomfortable. And I've been a passionate believer in the 12 years I've been in my role that an important part of the university's function is to promote that sort of debate, but debate which is respectful of each other's views, and actually how to disagree well is an art which we seem to have lost, and we get very sort of irritable with each other when we don't like other people's views. So I think tonight's lecture is really important in this context for the university and all of us here today. And I cannot think of a better person than Timandra to actually talk to us about it and provoke us to think about it. She is, as you will all know, a writer and presenter, has written very widely, and a real polymath, I see, with having qualifications in film and drama, statistics and mathematics, and then more recently philosophy. So a real polymath, and I kind of, my late father was a professor at UCL, and we were both great admirers of polymaths who can actually talk across the whole range of, academic disciplines, and of course, is a well-known writer and presenter. Of course, presented on radio, BBC Radio 4, the How to Disagree series, written quite a lot of books, including this year, I think, published it, Technology is Not a Problem. Ah, there we are. You see, we have got our promoter, Professor Bowie, next year. And of course, a lot of stuff around, you've written around data, big data, and does size matter and so on. So, I could not think of a better person than Timandra to give this open lecture this evening. So without further ado, Timandra, we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. Well, that's a very glowing welcome. I feel the pressure to live up to that now. Although I think all of it is true, so I can't factually dispute it. So, can everybody hear me all right? I'm not sure whether, yeah, good, okay. If at any point you can't, just like ostentatiously cup your hands to your ears and I'll try and speak a bit louder. So, How to Disagree is, as you rightly say, it's the title of a radio series that I made in, I think, 2018, in fact, like for Radio 4. Slightly annoyingly, they then sold it to Audible, which means it's not on BBC Sounds anymore, but in the spirit of people sharing PDFs, obviously, if you don't want to buy it from Audible and need it for research purposes, then that is facilitatable. But the reason I made it was that even in 2018, which feels a long time ago now, I was very concerned we were losing our ability to disagree well. And I think it's only got more acute since then, that problem. And now when we talk about that, it is often blamed initially on social media, as if we were all having civilized debates until we all had smartphones and social media came along. But I'm afraid that isn't true. And social media has exacerbated some of the things about it, and I will come back to that a little later, because that is something, in fact, I go into more in the new book, Technology is Not the Problem, which is on sale in the foyer, but apparently only for cash, because technology is a problem. There you go. So the first thing I want to say is disagreement is really good. Disagreement is vital, and it's a very good thing, and we should defend it and celebrate it. It's just that we're not doing it particularly well. Because it's a fact of life, as already suggested, that we all have different worldviews, assumptions and ideas, thanks to the fact that we all live different lives and we've built our outlooks on different experiences and different ways of thinking. And expressing those different ideas allows us to test our own assumptions and reasoning and to challenge other people's. And it reminds us that ours is not the only possible opinion and that we may be wrong. Disagreement is how human civilization progresses. For example, science has given us an unprecedented understanding of the natural world and practical benefits without which many of us would not be here today. I, for example, wouldn't be here today because I wouldn't have been able to get the fast train from St. Pancras. That's why science is still our model for factual knowledge and for resolving disagreements about facts, about the state of the world. Science as an institution runs on testing theories by experiment and by argument. And it harnesses the basic human urge to prove other people wrong in a system that's designed to get us all closer to the truth, regardless of who is making the claim and who doesn't like the consequences. So the Royal Society motto is, take nobody's word for it, nullius in verba. And you have to bring evidence and reason to the table instead of resorting to personal attack. Now, if you talk to scientists, they are human, and like the rest of us, they don't necessarily like being proved wrong, but they will all talk very generously about how they would rather be proved wrong than go on being wrong for years, and it's all part of the greater quest for knowledge. So in that sense, it harnesses the kind of the natural competition between people and turns it into a system that can bring us all closer to knowing more about the world. And this approach to factual disagreement, I think, has some lessons that we can apply to other types of disagreement. Avoid personal ad hominem attacks, or if you prefer, play the ball, not the man. Try not to hang on to your ideas emotionally, but welcome the opportunity to learn something new and improve your knowledge and your understanding. And remember that you are part of a much bigger collective project to expand and strengthen human knowledge. And one thing that helps science work as well as it does is broad underlying agreement about the methods and the standards that everyone should use. Now that is something that's harder to apply in other areas of disagreement. For example, disagreement about moral issues can lead us into territory where we don't share basic assumptions about which reasons should count. Take the issue of abortion, which is one that I look at in the radio series. There are profound moral arguments on both sides. It's possible to agree on the principle that murder is wrong, but disagree on the moral status of the fetus. And even if we agree that the fetus has, in some sense, a right to life, we may disagree over whether that claim is stronger than a woman's claim to autonomy over her own body. But we may also disagree on other claims. So, for example, a person of religious faith might simply argue that God gives infinite value to the life of an unborn human being, and so no other argument will persuade them that terminating that life would be justified no matter what the circumstances. And the question then is, what do we do in these situations? For an individual, a personal moral compass can lead to a course of action that they find, as an individual, acceptable, if not ideal. But when we debate the law, or social norms, but in particular the law, we are seeking to apply the same rules to everybody, including to people who disagree with our underlying view of the world. And this is where I think things get really tricky. When we're trying to impose our own moral standards on other people, it's surely incumbent on us to offer them reasons that others can understand and find reasonable, even if they don't share them. So, for example, I might accept the argument that a potential human being is irreplaceable, and that therefore the termination of a pregnancy is a wrong that can't simply be weighed against other non-fatal harms. It wouldn't persuade me that therefore a woman should be obliged to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term, but I can accept that it's a reasonable argument, that it's made in good faith, and that I need to offer a better argument against it than simply the fact that I don't believe in God. If, on the other hand, the argument that's brought to me is simply, well, God says it's wrong, then I can simply counter, well, for you that's a good argument because you believe in God. But as I don't believe in God, it carries no weight with me, and so we haven't really moved on at all. If the argument is abortion upsets me because it is counter to my religious beliefs, then I could similarly say, well, that's a good enough reason for you, but it's not for me. Although I am sorry that you're upset, and I will try not to needlessly upset you if I can avoid it. And this brings us to a central point in how to disagree well, the idea of reasonable disagreement. Rational people can reasonably disagree, even when they share assumptions and beliefs about how the world is and about how it ought to be. And since we don't tend to share all our assumptions and beliefs, it's not at all surprising that reasonable people will disagree. But it's vital that we remember this, and we don't fall into the trap of assuming that anyone who disagrees with us must be irrational or misinformed or simply a bad person. And it's vital for a couple of reasons. First of all, if we ever want to persuade other people that we are right and they're wrong, we need to engage with one another on the assumption that other people are as reasonable as ourselves, and that they have reasons for thinking what they do. This also means being open to the idea that they may, even if only partly, be right, and we may, perhaps just a tiny bit, be wrong. There's a lovely law in statistics called Cromwell's Law, which comes from Oliver Cromwell, who allegedly are in some kind of dispute with some Scottish bishops, which I don't know the details of, but allegedly said to them, "I beseech you, my lords, in the bowels of Christ, to consider the possibility that you may be wrong." And statisticians have adopted this as Cromwell's law, that you should always remember there is a possibility, unless something is absolutely logically entailed and inescapable, there's always a possibility that you may be wrong. So that means that we have to take seriously, when we're arguing with somebody else, we have to assume that they are reasonable and that they have reasons for thinking what they do. And we have to take seriously our own responsibility to offer them reasons for our beliefs and ideas, and not ourselves simply say, well, that's what I believe, or you're hurting my feelings, or you are clearly wrong and a stupid bad person. Even if, and by the way, none of this means that all ideas are equally good, because clearly all ideas are not equally good. I mean, to go back to the example of does the Earth move around the sun? Well, the Earth does move around the sun, and what you believe about it is not going to change that. And there are many things where not all opinions are equally good. The question isn't, are all opinions equally good? The question is, what do we do about disagreeing with people about which are the good opinions and beliefs and facts? And the second reason for assuming charitably that other people have reasons for their beliefs and are not simply being misinformed or stupid or bad is that we are going to continue to disagree about a lot of things, moral questions and political preferences about our shared world and how it should be. And we will continue to have clashes of interests that cannot be resolved to everyone's satisfaction because a win for you means a loss for me, or vice versa. There are some particularly political and social questions to which there is no one answer that everybody is going to be happy and satisfied by. But we have to continue to live together with these disagreements. Now, luckily, just as science grew out of the human urge to prove the other guy wrong and then harnessed it as an engine driving the pursuit of knowledge and truth, politics grew out of the desire to resolve these clashes of ideals and interests without having to resort to violence or to the repression of dissent. Democracy is not perfect, but it is designed to let clashing worldviews and interests wrestle with words in a public arena in ways that allow the loser to consent because the rules of the contest were reasonably fair. And everyone, even though they may not agree that the outcome is what they wanted, they can agree that the process was fair and it was conducted in a way that they could assent to. The other condition of democracy, though, is that minority views are tolerated and not silenced. We can continue to learn and to test our own ideas, even from people we think are profoundly wrong. Now, that obviously doesn't mean we need to let them shout others down, because that's the opposite of toleration and civil disagreement and free speech. But it does mean that we should acknowledge dissenting views and try to engage with them in good faith as much as possible. So finally, I do want to say a few words about disagreements on social media, because that is something that's very salient and also something I do address in the new book. It's very common now to blame the terrible standard of public discourse on the nature of the tech problems on which we conduct so much disagreement now, and on the kind of moderation or the lack of moderation exercised by the tech companies who own the platforms, or on misinformation, disinformation, and malicious actors. And the argument goes that we would all be having polite, constructive conversations were it not for the algorithms that either keep us in echo chambers or deliberately feed us emotionally provocative content to get us angry and upset. The argument is that we wouldn't be so polarised if we didn't see so much misinformation or so many bots designed to make us angry for clicks. And I'm afraid I simply don't think that is true. To start with misinformation, I find it such an unhelpful idea that I actually now won't use the word at all. Because misinformation and disinformation as categories imply the existence of a pure uncorrupted category simply called information, much as the two ugly sisters imply the existence of a Cinderella who is good and lovely and not ugly. But if only life was that simple. All information, especially information on the internet, was shared by somebody for some purpose. It may be factually correct, and again, I'm certainly not saying that everything on the internet has an equal claim to being factually correct or true or helpful, but even the information that is factually correct always forms part of some narrative which is only a partial picture of the truth. So if you label something as misinformation, that's actually more polarising than most of the doubtful content on social media, because it immediately tells anyone who is at all open to taking it on its own terms or to being open to information in it, that they are at best gullible and at worst malign. And that is a much more polarising thing than simply sharing information that may be true but happens to fit the narrative that you're trying to put out. It's important to remember that one of the reasons people are so inclined to trust random internet facts above what's often called mainstream media outlets, or perhaps more politely legacy media, i.e. broadcast, newspapers, magazines, the kind of media that we had before the internet was dominant. So one of the reasons why people distrust mainstream media and are more inclined to trust random things they read on the internet is the erosion of trust in the mainstream media. And that was already happening before the internet started to take over, and I would argue it's like fed the rise of us turning to the internet for alternative sources of news and information. So that lack of trust is only going to be exacerbated if you start telling people what they should believe and then telling them that their wrong opinions are based on being ill-informed. It's only going to feed that sense that people are being told by partial outlets what they ought to believe and what they ought to think, and further drive the distrust. What about echo chambers? Well, the good news is that research has shown that now when we increasingly get most of our news via social media, we actually tend to be exposed to a wider range of political viewpoints than previous generations who tended to mostly read one newspaper or listen to one or two channels or watch one or two channels on television and trust everything that came to them through those outlets and nothing else. I always, just to be mean to him, I always use my dad as an example of this, because for years and years he only read The Guardian and would believe everything in The Guardian, and nearly had conniptions when I wrote some articles for the Telegraph motoring section, because clearly I was now with the Tory graph and everything. Presumably everything I read about motorbikes was then right-wing lies. So he lived in much more of an echo chamber, I think, than any of us who get our news from the internet. But that's not quite the end of the interesting story here. So in 2016, when Trump got elected for the first time, Professor Chris Bale of the Duke University Polarization Lab decided with admirable intellectual humility that he had clearly got something wrong, because neither he nor any of his friends saw it coming or knew anybody or interacted on social media with anybody who was going to vote for Donald Trump. So Professor Bale actually went, oh, well, maybe I have a problem here. And he thought the problem might have been that he was in an echo chamber. So he did some research to find out whether exposing social media users to a wider range of political opinions could make them less polarised. He had volunteers, he got them to do questionnaires on their opinions, and he deliberately fed them social media content from the opposing point of view. But to his surprise, he found they didn't become more open to opposite views. In fact, they became more entrenched in their own views. It made them, exposing people to the opposing views, made them dig in harder to their existing beliefs. And it increased what Bale calls false polarisation, which is the perception that the other side is further away from you than they actually are politically, and that they are more hostile to you than they actually are. And this works in both directions for both Democrats and Republicans. Both sides started to see the other side as much more extreme in their views and much more hostile, and that obviously made them feel less friendly towards the other side. But in fact, if you asked them their views on different issues, they were less far apart than they thought they were. So what was happening when people encountered opposing arguments, Bale realised, was that they experienced the arguments as attacks on themselves, on the group with whom they identified. In his words, this is Professor Bale's words, stepping outside the echo chamber was not creating a better competition of ideas, but a vicious competition of identities. We are addicted to social media because it helps us do something we humans are hardwired to do: present different versions of ourselves, observe what other people think of them, and revise our identities accordingly. Now, I don't actually agree with his use of the word hardwired in this context, because I think our present obsession with building our identities and having them reflected back to us is a very contemporary obsession. It's very specific to the time and place we're living in. But I do agree with him that the problem with social media is not that bots and algorithms deliberately feed conflict and polarisation, but the problem is the fact that we don't go there to engage with other ideas, we go there to build and project and defend our own identities. And that is something that's been going on since before social media and smartphones, although it certainly fed that process. But in fact, if you go back to the 1970s, people were already identifying that this was increasingly dominating the way we interact online. So while we certainly could have better social media platforms to foster better disagreement, the thing we need to overcome is our own focus on how we are seen by others. And we need to engage with each other as if the content of our disagreement really matters, and as if it matters how we disagree, how we deal with ideas that we feel are challenging or difficult or even repulsive, and how we deal with the people who express them. We need to disagree as if other people are as reasonable as we are, and as if we will have to live with them even if we never come to agree with them, because those are simply the facts of human life. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going slightly disappointingly. I don't think I'm going to disagree very much, but I feel I should make a couple of efforts. But I really identified with something that you said about the election of Trump and reading The Guardian, which was my experience of Brexit, which is I realised I had to read more widely because I didn't see it coming, and it was a shock. And I realised that was an arrogance that, of course, I had all my sources. And so I did the same, a similar sort of thing. I made a project of just reading sources more widely. Podcasts, even Jordan B. Peterson, I didn't, and particularly if someone said, don't listen to them, that was like a magnet. Okay, what's the reason? So I was really drawn to that. These are the sort of 5 thoughts which kind of bounce off and are takes on some of the things you said. One of the things that perhaps you didn't touch on was there's something about engaging in disagreement and your state of vulnerability, your stake in what's going to happen at the end of the disagreement. So if I'm in a state of vulnerability, then I am looking for some sort of reassurance. So the sort of, if I lose, there's an existential threat, if that's my state. So if we're going to disagree well, we need to sort of have a compensator for people who might feel acutely vulnerable, some sort of charitable disagreement to counter the sense that really what I want is for us all to have a kind of safe landing at the end. So there's a sort of a bravery element of being willing to risk things, but also that risk mustn't be absolutely crucial. A lecturer, a friend of mine who teaches in London and has very large classes of lots of Muslim students, says the idea that we can have a casual conversation about topics like homosexuality with people who have quite strong connections to both British tradition communities and overseas tradition communities with different legal systems, with different legal consequences, and with connections, family, friendship connections, issues they could be challenged on when they're visiting their countries of origin or the countries they have dual nationality of. So there's a sense in which they've got quite a different stake in the debate. The risk is higher. The risk is higher. And so that raises a kind of challenge for the nature of disagreement and for the classroom and what you might expect for a free and open, relaxed discussion. What might be free for me might be actually a significant issue for your community context. And the second thing I worry about is avoiding disagreement because you want to avoid a difficult matter. I was an RE teacher, and therefore my classroom context was we did all the miserable topics, and so you needed a really light-hearted approach. My ethics students who are present here might snigger at this point. You needed a light-hearted approach to gloomy, depressing topics, because you had a lot of them to get through, and you don't want to be gloomy all the time because it just makes you sadder. So actually, but in the 2000s, that really seemed quite straightforward. You could bounce through serious topics. That's not my experience now. It's not. It seems more, oh, maybe I'm just getting older, but it doesn't seem to be as easy to bounce through serious topics anymore. And so I'm a bit stuck on what to do about that. How can we protect the disagreement space for the people who are perhaps managing that disagreement too? The third thought, which it was another point of agreement really, but you were talking about learning to live with the fact that we're not going to agree. I heard Trevor Phillips say there was something like 20 communities in Britain that are 100,000 plus of people from distinctive ethnic religio communities that are they're not ghettos, they're self-sufficient, thank you very much, they're doing fine. They've got the language, they've got the connections to home countries, they've got their distinct sets of values and traditions, and the idea that multicultural integration is going to be a bit like the idea of it 25 years ago, where sort of people would basically kind of anglicise. We just need to kind of understand things have shifted in the last 20 years of migration. So we need a different model for understanding what kind of conversation we might have as a country. And maybe, and this is I'm a bit worried about this, but I wonder if it might be the case, we can't afford to have a too thick, overarching cultural set of norms. We need a thinner one that's a little bit more flexible for diversity of those tradition communities, because we can't simply expect everybody to sort of fold in to our way of seeing things. These are communities, they are operating, they are successful. They're not going to just be slowly on the conversion to some sort of anglicised version of me. So I agree with you on that problem. The last thing is there something about the smugness, and this relates back to the certainty and the shock of the shock. I wasn't particularly surprised about last week's election result, and I wonder if the condemnation. I saw one of the news. I don't know if it was the Express. It said, "How could they do it?" on the front cover. How could they do it? Was one of the headlines. That's a tremendously smug position. And for all our narratives about how decolonial we are we just colonising the world with our idea of moral puritanism? And actually, how is that any different from where we were a couple of centuries ago when we were certain and right as well? I say we are sort of kind of owning that term as a sort of white Brit. But that means a bit of a surrender to our project of and I'm worried about that, because I like some things about the idea of international human rights, the idea of there being an overlapping system. I'm slightly more nervous about the future, where we have a sort of thinner culture of agreement, because that seems to have higher risks with more nationalistic leaders. So I'm really torn on that. I'm really torn on living with greater difference but then perceiving that as a threat. So the last comment I thought about was in response to finding hope. And there's something about that you alluded to, which is how bad you think your opponent is, and whether you really doubt their motives. They're out to get, and somehow we need to create the possibility that our dialogue partner, as opposed to maybe disagreement opponent, our dialogue partner has better motivations than we think, as a trick to lean in. So where do we want our shared conversation? Even if we can't invest in landing on a shared platform, maybe we can invest in a shared conversation that we will continue to have again tomorrow. That's all.